Hey everybody, I am Andrew Root here with Derek Tronsgard. We're trying something new here. This is the first episode of trying this. We're going to post, I don't know what you would call it. I mean, we're going to post a bit of longer episodes on YouTube and see if people like it that way. I mean, Netflix is now like broadcasting podcasts, so that's what we're going for.
Podcasting
I
is
don't know.
so 2014. It's all about the video now.
It's all about the video. So we're going to try that. So welcome to the YouTube version of the podcast, Ministry in a Secular Age. And Derek, let's jump in.
All right. Well, hey, it's good to be back. I mean, we've been on break for a while. It was a nice off season, but I'm excited to get back into it. So we've talked about this on the podcast before, but you like to send me cryptic text messages at weird times of the day, and usually it'll be about a future episode. I'm just gonna read this text that you sent me. It says, Derek, remind me to talk about grief porn. So with that, I'm gonna give it to you. What do you got?
Yeah, this was like usually what leads me to text you is like deep forms of annoyance, like cultural annoyance that I end up saying we got to talk about this on the podcast. But this was one of those situations where so I was in Kansas City with my good friend Mike King. Shout out to Youth Front and all those good people there. And he had just seen the movie Hamnet. And he's like, "You got to see this." I was like, "All right." We had, we're gonna go out to dinner, and then he's like, "I hadn't been, I don't go to the theater anymore. I'm an old man." And he's like, "Well, I'll take you to the theater, and we'll see this." So we were driving to it, and I texted Cara, my wife, and was like, "Cara, I'm gonna go see, Hamnet." And she's like, "Oh, I heard that's just grief porn. Everyone's saying that that's just grief porn." It's like I don't even really know what that is, but I went and it was incredibly sad, but then I became incredibly enraged that people could think that this movie is grief porn. And then I did read some of like the New York Times like thought pieces on this and things, and there was some pretty harsh words about it that this is a film, this is spoiler alert for everyone, this is a Oscar nominated film. I think Jessie Buckley won for best actress and actor in this film, but it's about Shakespeare, and it's about the death of Shakespeare's son, and that inspires Hamlet. So Hamlet, and it is. I mean, there is an incredibly sad piece, but I was just moved so much by it. I mean, it really was it wasn't really about William Shakespeare as much as it was about his wife and in her experience of raising these kids and losing this kid. And I became just really, after watching it, I was moved with how beautiful it was. This picture into life, to grief, to mothering, to parenting, and then just deeply disturbed that people would dismiss it or feel like it was yeah, like put it in the category of pornography, like making you feel something in some way, or a kind of objectification of something. And so it started to ring really well as I heard that, and then as I watched it, I thought that I started thinking a lot about Byung-Chul Han and Han's whole point that we've entered into such a smooth culture. We love everything smooth, that we just can't take negativity. So there's two elements of Han that are really fascinating next to this film, I think. And one is our obsession with the smooth, and therefore our rejection and absolute hatred for anything that's negative. We hate negativity as a kind of cultural reality. And you could see these in these kind of think pieces, like this didn't give me a choice whether I should feel this or not, which is just what art does. Actually, it tries to pull you into feelings. Your consent is that you show up to the theater or whatever, or hit play on this streamer. That's your consent, but it is supposed to bring up human emotions that you didn't even know you had. But there is a sense that it becomes disparaged because it makes us feel something negative. So the grief next to the porn is really interesting, because I also kind of don't think culturally these same people writing these pieces are all that against porn, which, I happen to have, as you'll hear, some big problems with pornography as a cultural artifact. But it's become kind of, I don't know, somewhat progressively cool to kind of think about porn as an okay thing or as a stigmatized reality. But to then call this grief porn was really interesting because Byung-Chul Han also talks about pornography, and he means it in a negative way, but he thinks our whole culture has become pornographic. And by that, what he means is he thinks we've become obsessed with this kind of form of transparency. We want everything transparent, and to such an extent that everything becomes transparent, and we become not only allergic to negativity, we become allergic to just otherness in itself, and like the encounter with real otherness. So we want everything objectified so we can use it. And of course, what this film does in watching this grief is that we have this deep sense that you can't objectify this kind of grief, that it is fundamentally mysterious in many ways. Like within all these religious traditions, grief and sorrow has been a deeply kind of mystical reality, or there's an inner reality to it that opens up to something deep and rich. And I think we tend culturally to want to call it pornographic because it's uncontrollable and we'd like to control it. And yet, I think this reveals something pretty cancerous about us as a cultural reality. That first of all, we would dismiss it as pornography. And what makes it bad is not that it's pornographic necessarily, thinking of this in a kind of cultural vein, but what's bad about it is that it's about grief because we can't stand negativity. And so those were the first elements that I just thought were, it, they just annoyed me because I thought there was something incredibly beautiful about this. It is deeply, deeply sad, and deeply sad, but there's also just something so human about it, and it made me wonder if we've lost connection with some of those kind of core human experiences.
I'm really glad to hear that you liked the movie too. When you told me about this, I was worried that you were going to be on the other side, like where those think pieces were. Last
Yeah,
week, I watched this on HBO. I was just sobbing by myself on my couch. Like, it was such a beautiful movie. So, again, if you haven't seen it, I would totally recommend it. But I want to go back a minute and help me put the pieces together on Han's argument there. So, go back to what you were saying about the link between transparency and negativity. So if everything
yeah.
is transparent and we've sort of opened up everything for the sake of authenticity, maybe even going back to Taylor a little bit, like why is negativity not appropriate like in that cultural context?
Yeah. Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, just to stick with the transparency a bit there. I mean, what Han really wants to get at is he thinks the depth of human life is in some. I mean, this is where he's like very Heidegger, where he thinks you can't really live a human life when you're in it, when you're deep in it, when you're living it, when you're doing things like raising children or, God forbid, burying children and dealing with that reality. You're always in the midst of interpretation. Like, what does this mean? And we see, we like see in the movie Jessie Buckley's character. She lives with a deep story that she's trying to interpret throughout the film, which she has this sense that there's going to be two children present at her deathbed. Like, this is the vision that she's seen, and she assumes that the second born of the twins, I think it's Judith, right? I think Judith is the name of the second child. That Judith is it barely survives childbirth, and actually is not breathing for minutes during after being born, and so she has and then is kind of sickly through the rest of her life. So the idea in Jessie Buckley's mind, is that in William Shakespeare's wife's mind, is that this is the child she has to protect, and then it ends up being the very strong first twin, the son, Hamnet, who ends up dying from the plague. But she has this story. So Han's point is, you have to live your life in interpretation. But what transparency does is it doesn't give you any mystery to interpret. It doesn't give any larger story. It just wants everything exposed. It just wants everything known so that it can be used. So in some sense, what he's getting at here is like the way data functions. Like, data is kind of just transparent, but there's no story behind it, which is one of the reasons why when we get really mad at big tech companies, what do? They drop their data on us, right? Like, they say, transparent. We're being transparent. You can have access to all your data. Well, it doesn't come with any way to interpret it. any narrative. It just is the flooding of information. So it becomes meaningless. It becomes completely meaningless. And so if you start to think of your own human experiences as simply just data points, like simply just experiences in a kind of pearl necklace of experiences that have no coherence, that you don't even have to do the work of trying to put a coherent story together, then all of a sudden to have this kind of experience is just a negativity that has no meaning within it. And it's just something that like late modern human life becomes avoiding all kind of negativity. Only have positive experiences, like only be a tourist within your life and have good experiences, because there's no value in negative experiences. Though again, our religious traditions have often said that the negative experiences, especially of suffering, death, loss, have deep meaning inherent within them. But the meaning is short circuited if you're not pushed to ask, what does this mean? What's what's going on here? If you're not even pushed to make ethical kind of assertions, which she does, which leads to the tension between them, is that she thinks William should have been there. He should have been there to say goodbye to Hamnet, and he wasn't. And it kind of frames the rest of her interpretation, even of her husband, after this. So Han's point about the transparency is that we become addicted with just, in some ways, just raw data, because we don't really have, I guess this breaks down my analogy a bit, but we actually even lose the string that holds the pearls together. Like the narrative string that would hold that together is kind of lost, and we're just left with a handful of pearls of experiences, and we'd like those all to be shiny and nice and not very negative, as we try to kind of live our lives inside this world of transparent data. So that's his basic point about that. And he just does think that, I mean, again, kind of, I guess my analogy is working here. Like, these pearls are really smooth, and we want to keep them smooth. We don't want to cut our fingers on them. We definitely don't want them to be jagged glass. We want them to be these smooth things that make us feel good, that make us happy, that keep us accelerating to try to get more of these pearl experiences, if you will. And so all of a sudden, having to watch a film about the death of a child becomes grief porn. It becomes pointless information, that can't really open up a window for us to have an experience of otherness, to connect with our own grief, to even just live in this other person's grief and have to share it, even as this form of art. We just find this to be, oh, well, a real downer, a real meaninglessness. So there's a really interesting juxtaposition that plays here, because we tend to kind of think culturally now that maybe pornography is just a certain kind of titillated entertainment, but then it becomes negative in this frame. Like, pornography is bad if it makes me have to feel something I don't want to feel, and feel it without some kind of consent. But I don't know. It disturbs me to have a culture that's so, I guess, allergic to any kind of, well, to the existential, to be really honest, like to the existential echoings of what it means to live and die, and would rather kind of just bombard ourselves with smooth social media, reels that keep us from ever having to confront the kind of storytelling like this, because you can't get this storytelling. And I mean, I like a dog video as much as anyone else, but these are very different pieces of articulating a human life.
Well, it's interesting too to think like this authentic experience keeps getting pushed out of places. So, secularization takes some of those spaces like churches away where not everybody is experiencing it there. Now, you're saying like it's getting pushed out of like entertainment a little bit, like for the culture's want of smooth and optimization. Like, what does that do to people when those places that you experience this keep shrinking and shrinking and shrinking? Like, that's interesting to think about too.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's a certain way. I mean, this is the other dynamic I really thought as I watched this. Like, there still has to be, like, there has to be some kind of public spaces where we're allowed to grieve. Like, where that we have these moments of communal grief. And maybe they're not kind of these broadcasted impersonal kind of ways of doing that, but places where we can have these realities of grief. And that's one of the really, I thought, one of the most, I don't know what you thought, Derek, but one of the most beautiful pieces of the film is in the midst of this tension, in the midst of her um, blaming Shakespeare for not understanding, not being there, and really not understanding what this was like. Uh, a divide grows between them, and finally she goes, she finds out, she thinks, I mean, this is really fascinating itself, like she thinks he's writing a comedy, and then she's told by her stepmother she hates that it's not a comedy at all, it's really quite a tragedy. And there it is, her son's name, or a derivative of her son's name, is the title of this play. So she goes to check it out, and there's just this incredibly moving experience of her watching this play, and watching, I mean, her deepest pain is that she loses this son, and she loses him alone. And she really thinks in her grief, no one knows what this is like. No one even has any semblance of even a diluted form of what it is like to do this. And yet here she is at the Globe Theater watching this play, and this everyone there, the hundreds of people there end up grieving with her and crying for her lost son. So there's like this twofold move. One, she really recognizes that William actually does know what it's like to lose the son. Like he isn't just cut off. His heart is ripped and torn apart too. So there's that connection. But then the other piece of it that I found really, really deeply profound was how she's so moved by all these other people being moved about the loss of Hamlet. When Hamlet dies and gives his speech and is lost, like she is moved by this. And one of the most beautiful pieces of it is that it is through the communal experience of the shared grief that she can actually finally say goodbye to him. So he finally like leaves, and she can finally say goodbye, and he can go into the void. He can go into death. He can rest in peace, if you will, because there has been, for lack of a better term, a funeral. There's been a public assertion of shared grief. I've said this many times on this podcast. This is why I absolutely hate the celebration of life, because the celebration of life becomes a comedy and not a tragedy. It becomes a way of, in a kind of comical way, and I don't mean that there's always laughter, but it's a kind of way of not looking death in the eyes. It's a kind of way of saying, well, a funeral is just grief porn. That's all it really is. So let's make it a celebration of life, and then we don't need all that negative stuff with it, right? Like we can have the person who's died have one more performance of the self from the grave, and it can become kind of a comedy. It becomes more of a sitcom. We can kind of celebrate it with a slideshow, and yet the kind of grief we see, that won't do. That absolutely won't do. She would not have been there if it would have been confirmed to her it was a comedy. The fact that it's a tragedy brings her there. And the fact that she watches these other people hold her grief, it's a very diluted form. It's nowhere near her grief. But the fact that they're experiencing that and crying with her, and feeling something like the loss that she felt. I mean, again, in a very diluted form, becomes incredibly healing to her, that she can let him go. And we see Hamnet kind of walk out of the frame, and say goodbye. And she touches her heart, and she smiles. Like everyone else in the theater is bawling their heads off, and she smiles and laughs. Like, this is joy. This is the joy of having your grief held, and having it publicly held as a testimony to how deep and how awful it is, and yet how you're not alone in the midst of it. The experience of that is really utter joy. And so there's a certain way that becomes a kind of worship experience. It becomes a kind of funeral that allows for that collective communal grief. And again, this is old man get off my lawn, but what I worry about is when we're like grief porn, then even as a form of art, we don't share these kind of grief. And then people who do experience this, which this is no breaking news, but I think we ignore this. There are people who experience this very thing, that lose a child, or carry that deep, deep soul crushing grief. And then when we continue to try to say comedies only, no tragedies here, we just leave those people utterly alone. And again, I worry even in pastoral ministry, it becomes really easy to say, let's only let's only do things in the cadence of the comedy and not the tragedy, because it's a real bummer. It's a real bummer to remind people of that, and we're fighting for voluntary association anyhow, so people have to kind of voluntarily associate. And I think the box office numbers, to be crass, will be better if we stay at kind of comedy level instead of tragedy level. And yet I think what we need more than anything is to never dismiss this as grief porn, but to call it something fundamentally human that we all have to experience, that we all have to share. And at its best, this is what art does for us. The person who's living with this, as I cry in the theater, and I got to tell you, there was like a 75-year-old man behind me who cried through half the movie. It was pretty annoying. I mean, but the fact to grieve that together, I mean, there was something really powerful that I wasn't on my couch watching it, that I was in a theater, and there were all these, I have to say, it was all octogenarians. It was all
Yeah.
people in their 70s and 80s, octogenarians, or their 80s. But like, it was like 80-year-old people and Mike and I, and they were all crying. But there was something really communal about that too. That was a little bit of an echo of what she was experiencing in the Globe Theater.
And I think the sad irony too is all of that smoothness is just another tool to outrun death, or to
Yeah,
let us think
to
that
deny it.
it's denying it, it's not coming for me. Unfortunately, the end of Hamnet, we are all going to experience that. Hopefully, not our own children, but death will invade our family systems at some point and touch us at the deepest levels. And to your point, the most beautiful scene of that movie is exactly what you said, when she lets go and experiences that incredible and utter joy at that release. And I think the only way you get to that is if you have those communal experiences that don't deny it and don't try to smooth it out or optimize it. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's it.
Well, there's one other element that I want us to touch on before we close this episode out, and there's this really interesting book, and I should have made sure I had the author right and the title of the book right. But I think it's Sacramental Poetics, in the author's name. I think her name is Schwartz, is her last name. But she does this really interesting thing where she talks about, I don't know, are you googling that, Derek? Is that right?
I am, but I'm not seeing anything.
It's not
Keep
coming
going.
up. Yeah, I know. Okay. Well, I'm probably completely wrong on that, but it's a really interesting book. I don't know, I'm looking it up too, but I don't know. Yeah, yeah, Sacramento Poex. Schwartz. What's her first name? Let's see if I can find this. Uh, Regina Schwartz. So this is 2008 book called Sacramento Poetics at the Dawn of Secularism. Stanford Press book. Really, I'd recommend it. Really interesting. But one of the things she does that just came radiating back to me as I watched this movie is, if I remember her argument right, so she talks about how this deep kind of sacramental ontology that people kind of experienced through the medieval period, and the way that the mass itself was kind of a central reality, and could really affect people. Something happened with Shakespearean drama, where people, and you can see this in the film in some ways, that people start going to the theater, and they start making a connection that when the priest goes and turns the bread into Jesus' flesh, that it's no longer the realism of it's lost, and they kind of start to think of it as a theatrical move. And so they think of this kind of as a theatrical reality. So again, I don't want to misrepresent her thesis. It's been a while since I've read the book, but there's an idea here that the way the kind of sacramental, especially through the kind of Lord's Supper, it starts to get upended because of Shakespeare, and because of the way Shakespeare leads to this very public act of going to the theater, of seeing a theater. And it's not that people didn't go to theaters before. I mean, if you go to Greece, and you go to Italy, you can find all sorts of Roman theaters and Greek theaters. But there was a deeper sense that there wasn't this direct realism that you get in Shakespearean kind of plays, and this whole infrastructure of the actor and the worship and the play in the ancient world were almost interconnected. And now you get kind of division of a storytelling for just storytelling's sake, and you get the actor as a performer, and it leads to the priest and the pastor becoming a performer like the worship service becomes a performance after this, and it becomes harder for people to kind of disconnect what the pastor does and what an actor does. And of course they're, doing this thing with the sacrament, but it's just, it's kind of play acting, and it moves you just like you cried when Hamlet died. You know what I mean? But it's not, this actor didn't really die. It's just he plays with this. And I do think there's something I've always, I mean, you can tell I remembered this thesis because I found it just so fascinating. But to watch uh, Jesse Buckley's character walk into the globe and watch people moved in that way. And there's a few other scenes like, like where she doesn't, all of a sudden they say her son's name and she's like, stop saying my son's name. Say, like, she doesn't even know how to behave at a theater because she's never really been there before. Like, this is a new kind of way of being. And then when she touches him, when he's dying and she touches him, and then everyone else does it, which is also a very worship experience of this kind of participation in this act that people don't really even know how to function within it. So one of the things that I came out of that movie thinking about is that, maybe Schwartz is right that Elizabethan theater, Shakespeare, breaks this kind of sacramental seal for us. But it also does create the potential conditions for shared grief and consolation to become an essential piece of worship. You know what I mean? Like, there's a certain way that it malforms, or it deforms our way we think about the sacraments potentially, but it also starts to preform and form us to be the kind of people who can share each other's grief, who can be sad in a kind of public way together, that can uphold each other's humanity in that way. All the way until this period where we start writing about grief porn again, where we decide we don't even want that. Like, there's a certain way that we become so malformed by our Instagram reels that we don't want that. Like, I want my algorithm to just give me cooking recipes, to give me exercise tips, and to show me dogs carrying sticks. That is it. Don't make me feel anything else. And so there's a certain way that you could almost like say pre-Elizabethan theater, you have the sacramental reality that gets cracked open, but it allows for these spaces of public grief and holding a story. But now, even with the kind of Instagram reel, YouTube short, which some of this podcast will be made into YouTube shorts, creates even these
God
conditions where
willing, yeah.
yeah, right. That it starts to even create these conditions where we can't even stand that reality, So there's this kind of sense where the Elizabethan theater takes away something with one hand, this kind of sacramental imaginary, which maybe we should really grieve, but it gives us with this other, which we see at the end of the movie, these collective experiences of feeling something together, of grieving, of being able to claim in the midst of the story something tragic, and being formed to be able to have communal experiences of the tragic, to maybe in our late modernity right now, we've decided we don't want that either, and that we reject that. And the kind of Instagram reel, the social media, creates the kind of agents who can't even bear um, collective experiences of grief in a theater or at home streaming, and so we call it grief porn and delete it and say it's somehow too negative for us to bear.